Welcome to Press Coverage. I'm Theo Gremminger. At Press Coverage, I try to find you the edge you need to win in fantasy football, and I try to bring on the sharpest guests. And today we're in for a treat. I got Dwain McFarland from Fantasy Life on. Dwain and I have been podcasting for years. It's been awesome to see Dwain in like your ascension here. Fantasy Life, you're absolutely crushing it, but it's still like the same old stuff that us high stakes fantasy managers were reading back in the day when you and Brian Drake were crushing it on the FF Hustle. Dwain, your articles are must read, and anytime you're on a Player Profiler podcast, you absolutely crush it. So welcome back to Press Coverage. How are you doing today, my man?
Hey man, I appreciate you having me on. And like I always tell you this and Dan Williamson. I mean, a lot of the guys that I've done a lot of podcasts with, like I always enjoy hanging out, with the players. I know you're out here grinding all these waiver wire bids on Tuesday and Wednesday nights, just like me,
Oh, yeah.
Of course, we're writing content for a much broader audience because most people don't play, believe it or not, in the kind of leagues that sickos like you and me are playing in, Theo. So, I've got to cover a lot of things every week where it's like, man, not in my league, pal. And I have a section called that in the utilization report every week, not in my league, pal, where I actually cover the potential free agents in typical home leagues that you and I, man, we're like, that guy hasn't been available since the draft. I don't know what you're talking about. That player was never available. So yeah, it's fun. But it's a constant, journey of trying to figure out like, how do I still hit that sweet spot and like still, really make sure that I'm trying to bring that kind of content to the people that, really honestly gave me a chance in this industry. Without the high stakes crowd, I never would have made it in fantasy football. So I still try to cater to that, but at the same time, like we're also running a site over at fantasylife.com, and 90% of people don't play in those kind of leagues. So I've got to also write about the other things. So it's been an interesting journey, but I'm trying to the best I can, like to hit that sweet spot for everybody.
Yeah, and it's sort of the same thing for me. We're both like, anybody who doesn't know this, like Dwain is not going to promote himself, but Dwain's done extremely well over the years in high stakes leagues. Had some really, really top notch finishes, FFPC, NFFC, those kind of leagues. That's sort of like it for me, where when I first started doing the content, it was like so high stakes driven. And now, I have a chance to do content for a lot different people. So it's like I kind of want to have that balance where you're providing content that can help somebody in like a 15-man roster league, and you're also providing content sharp enough that can help somebody in a $5,000 entry FFPC or NFFC league. So, you're doing a good job with that, Dwain. And anybody who doesn't read Dwain's articles, these like used to be paywalled, and now at Fantasy Life, these are not. So, Dwain, these are really, really top-notch articles. Tell everybody sort of when's the weekly like release, and what are you doing over there on the other YouTube channel, Fantasy Life YouTube?
Yeah. So as far as the articles, they come out on the utilization report comes out on Mondays, usually late Monday afternoon, early Monday evening. I try to have it out before Monday Night Football. Sometimes it's right at the kick of Monday Night Football, depending on how much there is to cover from the week. But essentially, it's all about following all of the data we know matters most and looking at these trends, and then really, ranking all the upgrades, the downgrades for the week, talking about potential trade targets based on ranges of outcomes, trying to get away from just the tropes of buy low, sell high. What does buy low or sell high even mean? What is a good price on a player? What's a bad price on a player? And we have a major new, thing on the site, and it's the utilization score. So I worked on that all off season. It's something that I've actually worked on for multiple years, but really brought that to fruition. And the utilization score takes everything into account. It takes a player's talent profile as well as the way they're being used. And it helps you quickly rank these players and what they look like over different time periods. And then you can comp those players. I help comp that player to other players that were similar to them based on the data. And then that helps really paint a range of outcomes. Like, here's the high end of what this player could be. Here's what the low end of this player could be. And that's huge when you're trying to decide how much FAAB to put on a player. Like, how much upside is there actually with a player? Like, we are actually bringing all of that with a data-driven approach based on things that we know are predictive for future fantasy success. And that's the only way that it made it into the utilization score, is if it was something that was actually predictive for future fantasy success. So all the utilization tools, those are premium. So that's a tier 2 access. So if you want the utilization score, you do have to pay for that. But But man, like it's a great tool to help you decide buy low, sell high, all that kind of stuff. But to your point, the article's free, comes out every Monday, and then every Wednesday I have my biggest risers and fallers in the ranks. And then I have a section at the bottom for like the sicko stuff, like the kind of gross start sit decisions you might have to make, and who I'm leaning towards, who I'm thinking about benching. We do a brass balls bench player. So if you have brass balls of steel, you're willing to set this player. And we can see scenarios like where you might actually have a better player to put into your lineup. So, and as far as the YouTube channel, yeah, it's just, go to MB Fantasy Live. So MB being Matthew Berry. Matthew Berry is the leader of the company. Some of you guys might have heard of that guy, yeah. Matthew Berry. So MB Fantasy Life over on YouTube. And we're doing a show every single day over there on that channel.
I'm actually in a Dynasty League with Matthew Berry this year. So nice. Scott Barrett's like, you want the spot? I'm like, I'll take the spot. So I'm in a Dynasty League with him this year, so shout out. But you guys are doing a great job. Shout out to my guy, Nando DeFino, who was doing podcasts for us last year, but a little busier this year over there. So, Dwain, that you sort of had this is sort of a great segue to our first conversation. You talk about the range of outcomes with adding a player. People are doing mental gymnastics right now, trying to figure out where the Chris Godwin targets and usage goes to. We are both sort of on the Jalen McMillan path, but then there's also other people saying, Sterling Shepard technically would be the next man in. Maybe they go with Shepard. You also have Trey Palmer in the mix, potentially in a Mike Evans role there. So you have two big-time target-earning wide receivers who were big-time producers for us in fantasy football, both gone. This is a fast reaction. But who are you comfortable using this week out of the Tampa Bay receiving room? And do you see a bump in usage for potentially a Cade Otton and the running backs as well? How are we supposed to approach Tampa Bay?
Yeah, so I think there's really two parts, to this question. One is like, what's the immediate outcome? And people won't like this, but we really don't know for sure what the Bucs are going to do. But if I'm placing a bet on one of these players, for the rest of the season, I'm going to put it on Jalen McMillan, the younger player. Not that I don't like Sterling Shepard, but the way I see Sterling Shepard's ceiling is maybe best case you get Wan'Dale Robinson, right? Whereas if things break right for Jalen McMillan, maybe you do get a wide receiver too. This is a guy that played inside and outside in college, had a lot of things we liked about his profile. Has not done a ton this year, right? His targets per route run on the season sitting at 12%. But last weekend, when you didn't have Mike Evans and you didn't have Chris Godwin, well, really even before Chris Godwin was gone from the game, you had 26% targets per route run. So in the one chance that he's had where you didn't have one of the other top playmakers on the field in that short data point, like he had a lot of targets, for the time he was on the field versus Sterling Shepard was sitting at a 4%. So I think the way I try to think about these things, Theo, knowing that we really don't know for sure and accepting that, is I want to take the player that I think could give me the better high end on the range of outcomes. And when I look at Jalen McMillan and I look at his skill set, it's much more aligned with what Chris Godwin was. And we're not saying he's Chris Godwin, guys. You don't just step into a role and suddenly become Chris Godwin. The role helps you, but obviously Jalen McMillan's nowhere near Chris Godwin at this point in his career. But when I look at Sterling Shepard, he can't do those things. He can't run the same route tree. He can't separate and do some of the vertical things that really McMillan can do. And that gives them more flexibility by getting him into the slot. And I think that gives their offense overall more upside. So we really don't know. It could be Sterling Shepard in the slot. It could be Jalen McMillan, but McMillan's just the bet I want to make, because if it goes your way, it's great. If you miss and you move on. If you hit on Sterling Shepard, it's like, what'd you even hit on? Even when you hit, it's like, okay, can I call him a wide receiver 4 this week? Oh my God, this week, there's a lot of bye weeks. I'm going to use him as a wide receiver 3. It's just tough to get there.
I'm completely with you on this one. McMillan has the cleanest profile of any of the wide receivers there. They drafted him, it seemed like, to be a potential Godwin replacement down the line. That gets fast-tracked. But this was a player that led Washington in receptions in 2022 alongside Rome Odunze, alongside Jalen Polk. This is like a blue-chip type prospect who dealt with some injuries that pushed him down to the third round. So third round wide receivers last year, we saw those guys hitting. We had the Tank Dells, obviously Josh Downs. So there's been a nice return on those guys recently. And I think McMillan's going to be the next one. I just have so much McMillan, Dwain, that it's almost like you get a little nervous being so all in on a guy we don't have a huge sample size with. But like when we look at the Godwin role and you're like, it's going to be less than Godwin, I completely agree. But it's like, we also have that real cushion where he could give you like 70% Godwin. And that's all of a sudden, you're still talking about a guy's giving you 13, 14 points per game. So very useful out of McMillan. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to continue discussing the Tampa Bay running backs. And then we're going to look at San Francisco. Brandon Aiyuk done for the season. Is it going to be Ricky Pearsall? Is it going to be Jauan Jennings? Or is it Deebo Samuel and George Kittle just going nuclear? We'll be right back at press coverage.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than. You 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back to press coverage. Theo Gremminger with Dwain McFarland of Fantasy Life. Dwain, a lot of times when you see big NFL news go down, I like to kind of get out of the bubble and go read like beat reporters, local news, see if I can find like that little extra edge. I'm sure you're doing the same thing. But I've been reading some Tampa Bay news reporters kind of predicting that maybe we see increased usage out of the running backs, that they lean on these guys. There's been also some chatter that they trade for a wide receiver. So it's a very fluid situation. Your expectations sort of for Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, do you upgrade these two guys, or is it really hey, the offense itself could take a slight downgrade, so I want to be a little bit careful with the running backs, even with potential for increased usage? How do you balance that?
Yeah, so I think all the running backs for the Bucs are going to get more targets because you don't have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin out there this year. I mean, this weekend, Godwin obviously done for the year. So we've seen that historically. Teams that don't have the high-end target earners up top at the wide receiver or tight end position, things just get spread out more. That's going to go to Cade Otton as well. We're just going to see a target share spread across all of these players without probably a clear alpha. The challenge with upgrading Rachaad White or Bucky Irving is the fact that, well, it's a three-headed committee. There could be a hot hand approach at any single moment. Rachaad White got more playing time last week because we saw the Buccaneers fall behind. So I think we did get a little bit of a tip there that most likely when they're in trailing game scripts, they want to have their best pass catcher out there. I still think they see Rachaad White as being that guy. He had 47% of the snaps last week. 36% went to Bucky Irving, 19% to Sean Tucker. Whenever we look at the route participation, though, 42% for Rachaad White. So almost half of it. Bucky Irving, not that far behind, 35%. So I think in the game scripts where you fall behind, you got to go to the check down game. Those are going to be the most, fruitful for Rachaad White. The problem is, you know how this goes, Theo. Predicting those games, a lot easier than it sounds. The NFL is a wild and wacky place. So I think there's game scripts where Rachaad White still potentially gets completely written out. Because of the three-headed committee. So as much as I would like to give them an upgrade because I think they could be more used in the passing game, the fact that we now have this three-headed monster kind of diffuses it all. There's not really much that we can gain here. And I don't know about you, man, but like I have a lot of Bucky Irving, and I think he still looked like the better player. He's not easy to get in your lineups. Rachaad White, not easy to get in your lineups. When I was doing the rankings this week, like it's still hard to get Rachaad White like anything higher than like the top 75 players. Like it's really tough because this is a hard situation to predict each week.
It's almost like fantasy football law in a year that we've had with so much attrition, so much injuries, and so many guys just like emerging that you all of your rosters, Dwain, either have like a flex that you really don't want to start, or you have a flex where you've got like 6 guys and you're pulling your hair out trying to figure out which one of your bench guys is not going to burn you if you leave him on the bench this week. So that's sort of where I'm at. And Bucky Irving's on some monster teams. I wish I had Bucky Irving on some of the not so great teams. So this year has been super, super weird. Let's pivot over to the 49ers. This is a situation where Brandon Aiyuk had only like one huge impactful game, but this is still an offense that's been traditionally very consolidated for us. Are you betting on Jauan Jennings or Ricky Pearsall if you had to pick one for your fantasy roster for the rest of the season as the de facto Aiyuk replacement?
Again, it's another really tough one where I try to make my strong stances around data points or film or things that I know have really historically mattered, right? And with this, it is really such a close coin flip between Jauan Jennings. On one hand, you have the guy that already had the explosion game this year, but we've seen that before. We've seen that before from guys, playing in this 49ers offense, come in out of nowhere and blow up for 30 fantasy points and then turn into nothing. And the challenge for Jauan Jennings is, while he's playing his best football of his career, he's got a 20% target share, by far the best mark he's had. He's never really been a strong target earner before. So the question becomes, is that just because he was playing with all these other really great players? Or is it because really he's not that good of a player? And the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. And there is a range of outcomes, as usual, with all these things. So if I had to choose, I am going with Jennings because he has played at a career high level this year. He has already shown us he could give us that blow up game, like what we saw a few weeks back, over 45 fantasy points. Just a crazy, crazy day. I remember I was all in on Brandon Aiyuk that week. No, just kidding. It's Jauan Jennings that's actually going to be the dude just balling out completely. And Brock Purdy was just giving him, he didn't care if he was open or not. He was just flinging it down there to Jauan Jennings. Now, Ricky Pearsall is still really interesting because here's the caveat. Jauan Jennings is still dealing with a hip injury. What if he doesn't play this weekend? That changes the calculus for everything, because if Ricky Pearsall goes out and balls out as their first round pick, Jauan Jennings could easily go right back to being the slot receiver on a team that doesn't run three wide receivers very often. So it's so tricky, man. It is so tricky. And it's a challenge because of how early waiver wires run in the week. So when waiver wires run early, and it's also a matter of, if I'm just betting on the odds for the rest of the season, I am giving a slight edge to Jennings, but I am acknowledging, man, like it could easily be Ricky Pearsall flipping the whole thing on its head this weekend. So the way I handled it, Theo, and it's kind of a cop-out, Jauan Jennings was the least available. So where he was available, I pretty much went all in. Ricky Pearsall was available much more often. So I was more balanced with my approach of him. I wanted to get shares, but I didn't want to miss out in the couple of leagues where Jauan was actually available. So I went with more of an all-in approach. And that's the way I try to think about these things, and I know that doesn't help everyone that's managing one fantasy team. So if you are managing one fantasy team, I would lean to Jauan Jennings, but I am telling you, like, it could easily go the other way. So I think this weekend, if Jauan Jennings plays and we don't have Deebo Samuel, and I think Kyle Shanahan's full of crap, and I think we never know what's coming out of San Francisco because none of the beat writers there really know what's going on. It's not their fault, but the team doesn't help them. The team doesn't give them information. In fact, the team misleads them all the time, and we see that play out with all these late-breaking storylines that we get from that team. How about a little hat tip on CMC, who we still haven't seen yet?
I mean, yeah, that was ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
Every year. The year Raheem Mostert was a starter, everybody thought it was Trey Sermon. Like, the beat reporters didn't know. And again, it's not on them. Like, it's all subterfuge. It's all deception. With just like Kyle Shanahan's offense, everything is misdirection. He does the same thing with the press. So it's not really a surprise. So I don't think Deebo's playing this weekend. If Deebo is out, then I think if Jauan Jennings plays, he's a wide receiver 3 this weekend. And you're hoping you get a wide receiver 2 performance. That makes Ricky Pearsall a wide receiver 4 this weekend. If Jauan Jennings is out, though, and Deebo Samuel is out, then I think Ricky Pearsall enters the wide receiver 3 conversation. Now, we have 0 bye weeks, but there's so many injuries at wide receiver, it's hard to keep Pearsall out of that wide receiver 3 territory. So there's a lot of ways it could go. If Deebo plays, that moves the rest of the guys down. Now, suddenly, Jauan Jennings becomes a wide receiver 4. Ricky Pearsall becomes a wide receiver 5. So a lot of moving parts, on this one. I do think you asked this other part, long term, this is the Aiyuk injury. It's Deebo, man.
Oh, yeah.
Deebo, when we have not had Brandon Aiyuk on the field, it's been astronomical. I mean, his target share, his targets per route run, his yards per route run, because his route tree gets opened up. He's no longer just the guy getting the stuff around the line of scrimmage. they start to draw up some more of the stuff that now beats man coverage. That gets him into the first or second read kind of territory on more plays. And the thing is, when Debo's given more opportunities, he's always shown us, Theo, that he can shine. I mean, when Debo is getting that kind of role, that he's a wide receiver 1 the rest of the way once he's ready. Once he's ready to go, he is a wide receiver 1 the rest of the way. We don't know if it'll be this weekend because then they get a bye week. Does it make more sense to rest Debo? You could be without him the next 2 games. But once he's ready to rock, man, it's going to be his show.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what you said. Debo, certainly, we saw him steam up in ADP towards the end of the summer. I think a lot of those teams are going to get heavily rewarded down the stretch.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit in the pre-show, sort of like the win rates flipping around. Debo might be the one that really, really shifts win rates and gives you like 20 points per game moving forward. Kittle obviously takes a step up, but Kittle's been crushing it anyway. And I think the way that you want to handle it with Pearsall and Jennings.
Yeah,
really
where are you at on it? I want to hear your thoughts on Jennings versus Pearsall.
My bags were all packed with Jennings. I had so many shares of Jennings earlier in the year and actually used him in a couple leagues in that like big time 45 pointer. So I already had the exposure to Jennings, tried to play a little bit of catch up on Pearsall,
Gotcha.
But he went for a little bit more in some of the leagues than I anticipated. It's a weird week for like trying to measure FAAB and all that sort of stuff. So
too many injuries to make it easy. So anytime, as a rule of thumb, like I have rules I use for FAAB, but you have to get away from those guidelines. Any week you've got a massive amount of injuries. So you have to always realize, and I know you do this, but like just for everyone else listening, when you look up and you know that some team lost Chris Godwin for the year, they have a super easy drop. The thing that keeps FAAB down is whenever there's not a lot of injuries, and it makes it tougher for your league mates to decide who are they going to cut. That's always the hardest part of FAAB. Honestly, it's not figuring out who to pick up. It's not figuring out how much to put on them necessarily. It's figuring out who the hell am I dropping from my roster. So whenever you have these weeks where it becomes super easy, Mike Evans out for 3 weeks, Chris Godwin done for the year, Brandon Aiyuk done for the year. Those 3 managers, they're going all in. They are in not every case, but they're going to be willing. And you know how FAAB works, Theo. It only takes one. The next closest bid might be $400 less than the top bid. But that
you bid against yourself,
bidding
against yourself all the time, Dwayne.
That one manager that had Aiyuk, he's going to the moon on Pearsall because so the first thing you do is you go see who is the Aiyuk manager and how much FAAB do they have. That's my starting point if I really want a player. So if I want Pearsall, the first move I'm making is who's the Aiyuk manager, how much FAAB do they have? If they're sitting there at 150, I'm going to use my normal range on a player like Pearsall, and I'm going to stay between 15 and 30% in the kind of leagues you and I play in, right?
Well,
I'm going to keep it in that range. But if I see that guy has $700 left out of his 1,000, and I really need Pearsall, well, now I've got a decision to make because now I probably have to bid at least 500 to have a shot to get Pearsall.
Dwayne, we'll go a little off subject here. Speaking of FAAB,
sorry, I think I just did that.
you're a poker guy. Okay,
Yeah.
so you're a poker guy and you're a big high stakes fantasy guy. Is there a particular number that you'll never end a FAAB bid in, or are you one of these guys who's like superstitious on anything?
I mix it up. I never end it on an even. You don't do 150.
No.
You don't do 130 because other people that are quickly going through it, you're going to end up in ties. So whatever you need to do to break a tie, if that makes it a 1, a 2, a 3, I love 7s, 8s, 3s, and 4s. Those are my favorites. 5s, also very typical. So I want to stay off of 5s, stay off of things that end with 0 to just, that one extra dollar, guys. You don't know how many times that has won me a huge player. Now you do the other steps I just talked about. So you want to be careful. You go and you look, the Aiyuk manager has got $233. Well, I'm not going to go 234 because anyone else smart enough to take that one extra step I just did might go 234. So I'm going 237. I'll go 238. I might bump it 10 above that just to give myself a little bit more buffer, depending on if, how much I want that player. So for me, mostly 7s, 8s, 3s, and 4s are the bids I like to go with. 0s, 5s, and 9s are the most common numbers that people use to end their bids.
Yeah, and we've done a big discussion on this with Darren Armani of Fantasy Mojo like twice on press coverage.
Yeah, because he's got all the data.
Historical data, and he basically went through a lot of what he said, echoed yourself. Also doubling up. A lot of people will do like 55, 44. That's just their way of speeding through.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of game theory with this. We could talk about FAAB bidding game theory for like 2 hours, but we got to talk about a lot more stuff. One player who saw a significant increase in usage was George Pickens this week. There was a lot of people sort of having mental gymnastics on the Justin Fields getting benched despite winning games and despite producing in fantasy, but we all sort of saw why Pittsburgh made the switch. Russell Wilson played very, very well. A lot of utilization stuff came in for such like stacked boxes, a lot less stacked boxes. But really, for me, the big takeaway was George Pickens to the moon. George Pickens looked exactly like we want to see him in terms of target share, in terms of downfield targets, end zone targets. And Dwain, of all the wide receivers we're kind of enthusiastic about, in terms of wide receiver target competition, he might have the fewest target threats on the team. So I think everything's shaping up for George Pickens rest of season. Do you share that sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, George Pickens was already doing the things that matter as far as telling us how talented a wide receiver is. And guys, there's context that gets involved with all this, but if you want like the quickest shortcut to is a wide receiver good, are they getting targets? That is the easiest way to know. I hear people, he drops the ball too much. Nah, the quarterback trusts this guy. Guys, we already know that. We already know if the quarterback cares about their drops, and we already know if they actually trust them or they love this other player. You know how we know? How often do they throw them the ball? It's the easiest thing, because guess what a quarterback wants to do? Get yards and score touchdowns. Who are they going to throw the ball to? The people they think are going to get them yards and get them touchdowns. It is not rocket science. If you just wanted to stop with that, it would be enough. It would be enough to guide you generally, as a rule of thumb, to being a better fantasy player, just following the targets. I know most people listening to this probably know that, but I have to, it can't be overstated enough. Now, we're adding additional context over at Fantasy Life, and that's what the utilization score helps account for. How many of those targets are catchable? Air yards matter. How many of those air yards are actually catchable? Air yards and catchable targets are actually sticky week over week, or stickier than a lot of other data points. Week over week, there's not much that's super sticky. But when you start looking at rolling 4 weeks over rolling 4 weeks, year over year, things like that, there are certain aspects that really get baked into that utilization score. And one of the bigger challenges for George Pickens to this point hadn't been the targets. He was getting the targets. Guy, I mean, in the 3 weeks before this, 38% target share, 24% target share, 35% target share. The difference, getting a 36% in week 7, is where he was getting targeted. Okay, what was happening before, a lot of his downfield routes were dying on the vine because Justin Fields wasn't getting to that read, or he didn't trust it. He was mostly only throwing the ball to Pickens whenever he was working underneath or intermediate. This last game, a 17.9 average depth of target, a season high, led to 70% of the Steelers' air yards. And then you think about Russell Wilson. You think about, how has Russell Wilson traditionally won? By making those deep shots. Now, here's a challenge. So I agree with you, Theo. I love George Pickens. I think George Pickens has a wide receiver 1 talent profile. The challenge is twofold. One, Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith can nuke you at any moment. And last week, the other thing we saw, besides just Russ, 94% route participation. That was his highest of the season. 3 weeks ago, it was 65%. He's had games where he's in the 70s. And Arthur Smith did this to Drake London. Arthur Smith did this to Kyle Pitts. Arthur Smith did this to Bijan Robinson. Arthur Smith does not know, like, if someone, he doesn't care if you're the most talented player. He's got something in his sick brain that says, nope, this is a Van Jefferson week. I don't know how he gets there, because he's not a bad schemer. He's not a bad play designer. But when it comes to getting these guys on and off the field, he just does weird stuff we can't predict. So that's a wild card. If you're suddenly only out there 80% of time on the second most run heavy team in the league from a drop back rate over expectation, that makes it tough. The other thing is you saw a lot of single coverage looks. Basically, they were challenging Russ, saying, do it. We dare you. We'll give you single coverage on the outside to George Pickens. We dare you to do it. Most teams these days are not doing that. Most teams are going to look at Russ and say, nah, we know that's your one thing in your bag, bro. We're not giving that to you. We're going to make you march the ball down the field, throw the intermediate throws over the middle. And that's the test that we've still got to see Russ pass, because he's failed that test miserably for the last 4 to 5 years. So I do worry teams will take that away. So here's what I would say on George Pickens. I love him. I do think he gets an upgrade from Russ. And by the way, Russ actually kept George Pickens from going nuclear. I mean, if you look at the throws, they were underthrown. George Pickens saved him. But the good news is the intent was there. He was willing to get it to him. And you have to imagine that connection gets better. But what I would say is, if people are so frothy on George Pickens, I think the actual sharpest move is probably to sell high. If
Okay.
someone is really looking at him as that high-end wide receiver 2 now. If someone only wants to offer you a high-end wide receiver 3 or low-end wide receiver 2 value on, you're not going to profit enough to take that deal. But if someone wants to offer you high-end wide receiver 2 or low-end wide receiver 1, they think he's there and he's in that zone. I think in more runouts than not, he fails to live up to that. So that would make him a sell in that scenario. So, I mean, it really comes down to your league mates and the way that they're valuing George Pickens.
Well, if you're in a league with me, go ahead and send me an offer involving George Pickens. I might take him off your hands for you. So, Dwain,
I don't think we have a
the,
league where we can trade, man.
That's right. That is correct. So it's an interesting one, and I think the timing will get there with Russ. Again, this is like Russ still getting acclimated to the offense. This was the first start of the year. So for me, like I'll see that, and I'll say like this is sort of like the success we saw with Cortland Sutton last year on the touchdowns. I think Pickens can get there with touchdowns. There's scenarios there. I think you're right. I think that defenses will start keying in on him, and it'll be how they adjust. But in terms of, again, I come back to the target competition, like I don't see how Arthur Smith can get away from this one. And also Arthur Smith goes from being like the man over in Atlanta to he's got Mike Tomlin sort of in his ear a little bit more in this situation. So I think
here's the range of outcomes on it, Theo, based on using the utilization score, which takes all these different things into account. Again, all based off of data that we know drive fantasy points. 30% of the time, a player with his profile is finished as a high-end wide receiver 2. 19% of the time, he's finished as a low-end wide receiver 2. So look, 50% of the time, this profile has ended up as a wide receiver 2. Only 7%, and I'm using his last 4 games, right? I'm using his utilization score for his last 4 games, which really allows this last game with Pickens to get weight with Russell Wilson at the helm to get weighted appropriately versus just using his utilization score for the whole year. But only 7% of the time, has it been a wide receiver 3. So that's my point. If you can get him in that wide receiver 2 territory, I think you have room to profit. But the closer you move to wide receiver 1, the tougher it gets. I will say 40% of the time, someone in this range of the utilization score has been a low-end wide receiver 1. So that's actually a little better than I thought it was going to be. So I would be willing to even buy Pickens potentially as a high-end wide receiver 2. I would be locked into buying him if someone is going to have a price tag that's around the low-end wide receiver 2 mark. So that's the way I would play it based on the range of outcomes.
Here's a trade scenario for you. Garrett Wilson or George Pickens rest of the season. Garrett Wilson obviously gets the target competition in the form of Adams, in the form of Breece Hall. George Pickens, no target competition. Garrett Wilson, you've seen it a million times, Dwain. It takes a little bit of a leap of faith to make this one. Are you there on this trade, or would you prefer to keep your guy who's you've seen, swallow up targets year after year?
Yeah, I think, it's really interesting. I think that is like the line. Because if I put in the utilization score for, Garrett Wilson and my expectation of where I have to make a little bit of an adjustment to it because we don't have the full Davante Adams experience yet. I think that pretty much makes them both, like from a trade value standpoint, like mid-range wide receiver 2 is kind of the break-even point where you could end up seeing yourself being just as profitable either way with both of them. But if I had to choose between the two, man, I think I do lean a little bit to Pickens just because of the clean path of not having to deal with Davante. There is a run out for Garrett Wilson where the chemistry becomes so strong with Aaron Rodgers that it nukes his value. And I try not to overreact to little things. And I've always been a Garrett Wilson telling people to go trade for him. And it ended up being right. Of course, then they signed Davante Adams and it can end up being wrong again. But I do worry about a pass that bounces straight off of you and ends up being a pick for the other team that honestly iced the game. It killed your team.
Yeah.
And those things can stick with a quarterback. I'm not saying it's predictive, but it could be enough to where Rodgers does decide, man, okay, I'm done. Once Adams is up to speed, I'm just going to feed him more. So there's enough there that I'll say, okay, fine. We can go with Pickens.
Okay, there we go. And I'm sure you've had to discuss the Davante Adams, Garrett Wilson usage split for about, every single day since the trade went down. Let's pivot. How good does Breece Hall look in this offense run now by Todd Downing? His rest of the season outlook. Can Breece Hall challenge, the very successful older running backs for the RB1 overall on the strength that he has as a pass catcher. This past week, we saw the most receiving yards he's had all season long, and that was after he got 56 yards the previous week, which was at the time the most he's had in all season long. This has been nothing but positivity for Breece Hall in like a Christian McCaffrey-like role under Todd Downing. Your expectations moving forward?
And that's it. It's the closest thing we have in fantasy football to a Christian McCaffrey role. We saw it earlier in the season for Alvin Kamara. The Saints, obviously, the offense fell apart. They didn't make adjustments to the 6-1 front. Their entire offensive line got decimated. Still waiting on a counter punch from Clint Kubiak. But with this particular offense, what we've seen with Todd Downing, yeah, Breece Hall has the best utilization score in the NFL over the last 2 games. Now, typically, I don't do sample size stuff like that, but in this case, it makes sense because we've got Todd Downing taking over as offensive coordinator. That is the change. So, man, snaps, 85%. That's elite, Theo. You know that. 83% of the rushing attempts, absolutely freaking elite. Looking at his role in the passing game, 76% route participation. That is through the moon. That's CMC level. And then target share, 22%. That's elite. I could see that coming down a little bit just because so much is going to get channeled through Devontae Adams and through Garrett Wilson. But still, I mean, if he's around 16, 17%, that's still going to be just absolutely huge. So fantasy points per game over those 2 games, 24. Obviously, you guys all know that that's really good. But, man, the utilization score at 9.6 over those 2 games. If you look at his comps, going back over the last 4 years, I mean, it's really hard to find backs that didn't have top 6 finishes that had that kind of profile. So, yeah, I think Breece Hall right now is in the conversation for top 3 over the rest of the season. His comps average 20.8 fantasy points over the last 4 years. It's hard to say he's going to be the number 1 just because it's such a strong year for running back, right?
Oh, yeah.
We got Saquon going bonkers. We got Derrick Henry doing Derrick Henry things. We've got Kyron Williams doing his thing. I mean, it's the year of the running back, man. There are so many running backs sitting up top of the board, and that's what makes it difficult just to say for sure Breece will be the guy. But, man, you get the youth with him. I mean, I think there's a lot of things to like about Breece Hall. So he's certainly in the conversation. And if you held on to him, if you made a trade for him, you should be elated about Breece Hall.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because we get the Jeff Ulbrich taking over and you get the defensive coordinator taking over. I was a little worried that we were going to see increased Braylon Allen. It's been anything but. It's been pure Breece Hall. And Todd Downing, no real track record of success as a coordinator. And now he looks like this super sharp guy. He's getting Breece Hall the ball like we want. We love you, Todd Downing. Keep it up, man. Let's talk about
It's amazing how we think someone's smart. Just when they feed the guys that we want.
Yeah, like Mike McDaniel last year, smartest man in the world. Any guy that gets my players the ball, Dwain, the players that are supposed to get the ball is very smart. Let's talk about 2 situations with guys that are underperforming at ADP, and then I want to get you in a couple lightning round questions.
Sure.
Let's specifically talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. You've been tweeting sort of, I would say positively, keeping a optimistic outlook. There's a lot of others who are very, very concerned about the situation in Arizona. And then also, let's touch on Sam LaPorta. 17 targets all year. Dwain, can we get a bailout this week with no Jameson Williams?
Yeah, so we'll start with Marvin Harrison Jr., and it's really just looking at the underlying data points. I don't doubt that Marvin Harrison Jr. is good. I'm not saying that Marvin Harrison Jr. is playing at peak form, but I mean, we're talking about a guy, I get it, over the last 3 games that has left a sour taste in people's mouths. 5.6 fantasy points, 0 in the concussion game, and then 5.1 last weekend. So I get it. People are queasy. Can I put this guy in my lineup? Is this guy the worst draft pick ever? How did I ever let myself take him in round 2 of fantasy drafts? All valid questions, and I totally understand them. But I feel like what I try to do in these situations is honestly lean into the data that has historically told us whether or not a player is good. And most often, these things will regress back to the mean for this sort of player. It doesn't happen all the time, guys. The utilization score, the beautiful thing about it is it paints the corners of the outliers and what they look like. And outliers happen. We have guys without roles score a lot of fantasy points. We have guys in great roles that look like they're talented, sometimes not score fantasy points. So, but when we look at the median, you think about a bell curve where most of the players are going to end up, That's really what we want to base the way we're going to move forward. That's how we want to think about making our moves. And when you look at Marvin Harrison Jr., Theo, like just all the underlying data points are too good. He has a 26% target share. That's a wide receiver one. Okay. He has a 35% target share against man coverage. So these people saying he can't separate and this and that and all these other things, I'm sorry, man. If you're no good in man coverage, you don't get targets if your quarterback doesn't trust you. He's at a 35%. That's an alpha wide receiver one. The best wide receivers in the league, you see them distance from their teammates against man coverage. Marvin Harrison Jr. is doing that, okay? And then the final thing, air yards, 41%. That's a wide receiver one as well. So in all the things that are the most sticky year over year that historically have meant future fantasy points, he's hitting all the things. The main thing is it's the offense right now that they're running with Kyler Murray. Kyler's not comfortable right now. Kyler's not playing well. He's not seeing the field well. And
he's missing him, Dwayne. He's
missing Marv.
Yeah, you've missing him several times.
Only 55% of Marvin Harrison Jr.'s catches or targets have been deemed catchable. That's the second worst out of 64 receivers with at least 150 routes. Now, part of that's his average depth of target. The further down you go down the field, the less catchable, right, that passes become for two reasons. One, it's further away from the quarterback. That gives you a chance for less accuracy. And then the second thing is the further you throw down the field, the more likely you're dealing with two defenders versus just dealing with one. And that brings catch rates down, sends contested catch rates up. So there's a little bit of noise there, but it's still under where we should be versus historical rates. So yes, the challenge right now, in my opinion, not just from the data, but going back and watching all the plays of these guys, is Kyler. And he's missing him. And not just that, he's not seeing him wide open. Multiple plays where early in the progression, Marvin Harrison is wide open and Kyler's looking in his direction, doesn't throw him the ball, waits another second, and then throws it to Marv once he's now covered. Because now he's past a window. He's now in another window of the zone, and Kyler just leaving him hanging out to dry. So I can't guarantee that Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to turn around because Kyler Murray has to turn around in order for that to happen. But here's what I'll say. He's the top guy on the team. Him and Trey McBride, everything's condensed around them. So I typically just want to bet on players like that. So that's my stance on Marvin Harrison Jr.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm going to remain optimistic on Marvin Harrison as well. I get a lot of questions on my shows about him, dynasty-wise, redraft-wise.
Tough schedule coming. So, I mean, you got to keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's sort of like the life finds a way, though. All of the metrics, it's not like we've seen a reduction in target share or anything like that. And like you said, the air yards are there. So he could be a spike week guy down the stretch, even with some tough matchups. Like you said, it's also consolidated. So we don't have to worry about like the threat of Michael Wilson, the threat of Greg Dortch. That beginning of the year, people were talking about that a little bit more. And that's really, really not the case. It's James Conner, it's Trey McBride, and it's Marvin Harrison Jr. But I am worried about Sam LaPorta. This has been one where this is, it's incredible to me, Dwayne. This is a guy that set the rookie receptions record, finished as a tight end 1 overall, and he was like top 3 in everything else, in rookie touchdowns of all time in a single season, yardage in a single season. He had nearly 900 yards. And Dwayne, this was not like 120 targets as a rookie tight end is insane. To see this sort of reduction is even crazier. Is it the running back usage in Detroit? Is it Jamison Williams coming on? Like, I've heard many different arguments for what's happening with LaPorta, but even the most concerning thing to me, Dwayne, is he's had back-to-back one-catch performances post-bye week when we expected maybe they're going to get things right with him after the bye. So I don't know. This one's really weird for me.
It is really weird. This is one I can't explain because Sam LaPorta was a very talented player in college. You know, he was a guy that last year I was actually pumping up as a rookie tight end. You should be drafting, even though at the time it was like, oh, we can't draft rookie tight ends. They never succeed. Like, you got to look at all the layers of a situation. But I'm very blown away. Like, I thought Sam LaPorta deserved to be the tight end 1 off the board this year. I didn't get a lot, but that was more due to because I thought there were other players similar to his range still that I could get later in drafts. So I don't have a ton of those 3rd round Sam LaPorta shares or over at FFPC round 2 Sam LaPorta shares. But man, it's a tough one, Theo, and I can't explain it other than shit happens, man. Yeah, variance happens, and we're seeing an outlier case here with Sam LaPorta. I still believe he's a good player. Here's where it gets challenging. His targets per route run aren't just worse than Jamison Williams and Amon-Ra St. Brown. They're below Khalif Raymond. Yeah. They're below Tim Patrick. So the emergence of Jameson Williams is the easiest thing, right, to put this on. But really, Jamo's faded, man. Jamo started hot, and now that teams started paying attention to him, Jamo has not passed the second part of his test, which is once NFL teams know that you're a playmaker, they're going to start giving more resources to you. And then it becomes, can the player take the next step to show us they are a star? Jamo's failed that test. Now that teams have paid attention to Jamo, he's fallen off the map. His targets have fallen off, but Sam LaPorta's haven't gone up. So I can't explain it, man. It is really weird.
Like you mentioned air yard share, you mentioned target share, and then we'll also say first read looks. He's sub 10% on everything. And you bring up Khalif Raymond, like that's crazy to me. And when you heard this week, like how they're gonna make up, I wanted to hear like the coaching staff be like, this like talking up LaPorta this week. They talked about Khalif Raymond as a guy they consider to be like a starter. So they love Khalif Raymond.
They talked up Allen Robinson.
Oh my God, I saw that too. But they didn't mention Tim Patrick though, which was interesting. You would have thought he would get a mention since they're mentioning every single wide receiver. I
would still bet on Tim Patrick over Allen Robinson by far.
A million. That's little veteran deference. Let's talk up the old man in the locker room everybody likes. Let's go rapid fire, Dwain.
Yep.
Still hope in the second half of the season for Dontayvon Wicks. He caught a touchdown last week, had 6 targets. Where are you at on him?
Dude, Wicks just had a bad run out, Theo. He had the untimely drops in the one game that he was about to blow up without Christian Watson. And then he ends up getting hurt. Watson comes back sooner than expected. Like it was Lemony Snicket's unfortunate series of events, or whatever the hell that book is called. Like all these things happen to basically torpedo a huge breakout from Wicks. But here's the thing, over the last 4 games, he's still led or tied for the team lead in targets per route run. And it's not really, he's at 35% over that stretch, guys. Guess what? You don't get that if your quarterback doesn't think you can ball. And so I still think Wicks is a guy you want to hang on to. Also playing against the Jags, a terrible pass defense in itself. And guess what, Theo? You don't usually see this combination, but a terrible pass defense that for some reason wants to play man coverage among the tops in the league. Guess who the number 1 target earner this year against man coverage is for your Green Bay Packers? It's Dontayvon Wicks at 26%. So checking a lot of alpha boxes, still a believer. I would be trying to buy him in Dynasty if people are kind of losing their faith in Mr. Wicks.
Yeah, I love your enthusiasm with Dontayvon Wicks. And shout out, I love Jordan Love this week in DFS. I think he's going to go absolutely nuts this week, Dwayne. I said on another show that he's going to throw for 5 touchdown passes this week. So I'm excited.
Totally
about that
possible
one.
Against the Jags, man.
David Njoku, rest of season should be considered to be a blank tight end.
Mid-range tight end 1 with upside to be a high-end tight end 1 if we have Jameis under center long-term. We get DTR back, submarine to low-end tight end 1. DTR has a 45% completion rate over the last 2 years. He's terrible.
He's the sneaky way to get high-end tight end 1 production. I think this is if you're in a league with trading, go try and see if the David Njoku manager thinks they're selling high, because we've seen it now for back-to-back weeks with the target share. That is something, like Dwayne said, is predictive. David Njoku, actually, the 14 targets that he had last week, that just tied a career high. So we already saw this the end of last season, how he was able to go on like a nuclear run in fantasy. So I love it. Where should Amari Cooper be expected to be rest of season? Is he a guy that you think could give you high-end wide receiver 2 production? Should we temper our expectations? Where should we be at with Amari Cooper? Could he be like a 2023 Stephon Diggs rest of the way?
Yeah, I have Amari Cooper graded as a mid-range wide receiver 2 the rest of the way. And when you hear me make these, predictions, it's all based like on the data and stuff and history. And that's the midpoint. So that means I think his ceiling is a high-end wide receiver 2, most likely, maybe a low-end wide receiver 1 in the like extreme range of outcome scenarios there. Low end is probably a low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3. But I think in most outcomes, he ends up being a wide receiver 2 that you're pretty much wanting in your fantasy lineup every week moving forward. Might have one more week of acclimation here with the Bills, but once we get through this week, you're going to feel really good about Amari the rest of the way.
Yeah, I love that one. Dwayne, and this will give you, if you like don't want to listen to us at the beginning of the show, I'll say you're going to want to go read Dwayne's articles after we talk about this. He goes into detail on heavy zone coverage teams and how this is beneficial for running backs. It was very interesting stuff, very cool stuff to read about. Which teams can we exploit with our fantasy running backs that run this heavy zone coverage?
Yeah, and just like a quick disclaimer here, like and I don't want this to come off as sounding wrong, but most of the things you hear and that you read about zone and man coverage is all complete noise, right? Because you start cutting samples down, and you're just ending up with a bunch of noise. And the way all these coverages get played, what I found to be the most sticky in the data is sticking with it is a team playing man or zone coverage, period. You start getting into all the coverage types, man, it changes so much week to week. It's really brutal to try to figure out. And the one overarching takeaway you should have is when you're playing against a man-heavy team, Theo, typically the alphas get fed, and those are usually your wide receiver ones. Sometimes it could be your tight end, but the quarterback knows they have the matchup they want. They know they have it. And so what happens? They go to the wide receiver. When you play against these zone-heavy teams, things get the distribution gets spread out across all the players. The alphas go down, and they're still usable, but they're not getting the same target share they get against man coverage. So quite often, that's the tight end and the running backs that go up. And think about the way zone coverage works. A lot of time, depending on the kind of zone coverage, that leaves the underneath areas of the field sometimes exposed. That leads to more checkdowns by quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are more confused by zone. Yards per route run are less against zone than they are against man coverage. The completion rate goes up against zone. It goes down against man coverage. There's all these trade-offs. But the matchups that you can really look at this weekend, and you're starting these players, but if you're thinking about props is where I would think about these guys. Bijan Robinson for the Falcons. He's playing against the Buccaneers, the most zone-heavy team in the NFL. Bijan has an 8% target share against man, 13% against zone. So expect a little less for Drake London, Darnell Mooney this week, a little more for Bijan, and maybe also a bump for Kyle Pitts. Kenneth Walker of the Seahawks is playing against the Bills. They are the 7th most zone-heavy team, and that's about the cutoff. We should only be looking at the extremes. If people are talking about these zone coverage and man coverage in the middle, where it's just in the average, you only focus on the outliers. Super man-heavy, super zone-heavy, and I use percentages for the cutoff, and the cutoff I use is they can't play more than 20% zone. The league on average plays zone almost 68% of the time. So whenever I look at these, these man-heavy teams, 40% of the time they play man. So you have to be 20% or below on man coverage to qualify here. So the Bills made it. Listen to this one, dude. Kenneth Walker has a 1% target share against man coverage, 14% against zone. Kenneth Walker's getting more targets this weekend.
That's the best. Write that one down, everyone. And Ken Walker's absolutely been crushing it. He's going to set his career high in receptions in like
I think it could happen, especially with DK out. Yeah, it could really happen, man.
Imagine that.
Final one, Kyron, 4% against man, 11% against zone. He plays the Vikings tonight. That's the 5th most zone-heavy coverage team in the league. So expect a little bit more to Kyron. If we get Nakua back also next to Cup, then you got to keep that in mind. You might not want to be betting any of the overs on the Kyron receptions. If we only have Cup, I think you got a little bit better shot.
2 running backs that people might be able to trade for. Let's talk about like 2 trade targets here. Chase Brown and Kareem Hunt. Your enthusiasm on these 2 players moving forward, Dwain?
Yeah, and again, it really comes down to the way players are getting valued, but I love going to fantasycalc.com. If folks haven't checked it out, Theo, I'm sure you've seen it. They've got a trade tool in there where you just type the player in, and it gives you an estimated value of the player based on thousands and thousands of trades that have occurred. And you can see basically all the trades that have happened across all these leagues for the last 2 to 3 days. And man, it gives you a ton of ideas about how you might approach a trade, what kind of players you could be getting. But the thing with Chase Brown is we've seen him lead the Bengals in rushing attempts over the last 4 games. But the market has not adjusted when you go look at these tools that are available to us. So when I look at Chase Brown, I look at him already as a guy getting the early down work and an offense that I really like. That makes him a low-end running back too. But what if he somehow starts to carve out more of the passing down role? And it's funny what people will say, oh man, he's never getting that. 3 weeks ago, everybody said, no, he's never getting the rushes. Those are Zach Moss's. Guys, we don't know. So you got to leave yourself some upside there that if Chase Brown starts to take over the pass down role, suddenly you're looking at a guy in an offense that we love so much that, man, he could be a borderline running back 1, and the market hasn't adjusted to this yet. Kareem Hunt, it's just really there's nobody else. Kareem Hunt doesn't look good, guys. I've watched him, doesn't look good. Numbers don't look good. But we're talking about the Chiefs, and they're as run heavy as they've ever been because all their weapons are hurt, man. I mean, we'll see what happens here with DeAndre Hopkins, but the Chiefs are a run-centric team, and they've made Kareem Hunt the centerpiece. I don't want to go overboard on Kareem Hunt, but if you do have a manager in your league that's still thinking, oh, the other shoe's going to fall, I mean, I look at him as a running back too, the rest of the way.
Give us a sleeper, Dwain, that could gain value over the next few weeks that maybe people are a little bit under on. I know you talked about a couple guys in your article. You pick one for here.
Yeah, I mean, look, the name we already discussed was Jalen McMillan.
Yeah.
But there's two other guys right there in that conversation, and they are Cedric Tillman, and then we're also talking about why is my mind going blank? Wide receiver for Troy Franklin. Come on. I don't know why I nearly blanked on that. Those are two huge ones, man. But Cedric Tillman with Jameis Winston under center, man. Jameis likes to live that YOLO life, and that's what Tillman does. 3rd round pick out of Tennessee a year ago. Had a 24% target share last week in his first game taking over for Amari Cooper. There's a real chance that Cedric Tillman is the ad everyone should have made over Jalen McMillan. I had those two as almost a near coin flip. I leaned a little more to McMillan, knowing that he would probably get more of the bidding, and I would probably lose out on him more. So I had him at the top of my bids more often. But, man, Cedric Tillman could still be on your waiver wire. And if he's with Jameis, like, he has wide receiver 3 upside immediately this week. And if it all really goes well, like, I know this sounds weird, but life comes at you fast. We could be talking about him in that wide receiver 2 conversation.
It's wild times, wild times. Troy Franklin, I mentioned him on another show. This is going to be 2 weeks in a row we've seen for him with double-digit PPR points. You obviously have the locker room narrative with Bo Nix. I agree with you. I think Troy Franklin is the one that next week is going to be everybody's sort of popular waiver wire ad. That team is screaming for a player to absorb targets, and Bo Nix has looked a little bit better than we thought.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's been more on the rushing end, but winning makes quarterbacks confident. And when your quarterback is confident, they're willing to take some shots. So I think that offense could potentially open up. This is a great week for it. That Carolina Panthers defense is super fantasy friendly to go against. Dwain, you crushed it as always here on Press Coverage. Recurring guest at this point. Press Coverage is when I start getting these recurring guests, Dwain, you know the show's been going on a little while. So
yeah, you're doing a great job with it, man. Congrats.
Really appreciate that for sure. Let everybody know once again what you have coming out and where they can find your work.
Yeah, you guys can just go check out fantasylife.com. All the tools, all the articles. The articles are all up for free. Again, you can check out the YouTube channel, MB Fantasy Life. Anywhere you get your podcasts, you can check out Fantasy Life as well. Myself and Ian Hartitz pretty much putting out a show every day of the week. We got Chris Allen, Paul Charchian. We've got a ton of people helping us with put out, the fantasy football content. Matthew Friedman. So really great team. You guys just go check it out. And yeah, it's not too hard to find.
100%. Make sure you check out all of Dwayne's work. It's all great. Check out Sleepers, Streamers, and Stashes. I've been dropping that on our podcast feed and on our YouTube, usually Friday or Saturday. I'm giving you a sort of a waiver wire of the future and also some guys you can stream this weekend. Check out School of Scott. You got to go over to Fantasy Points for that one. I'm recording it with Scott Barrett every single week. And stick with us here at Press Coverage. We're going to help you crush your leagues this season.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.